to live stream.
Is it
Now
working now?
yeah, setting
Okay.
up your meeting.
Okay, great.
It's live.
Hello, everybody, and a warm welcome to the World Goodwill Seminar in New York. This afternoon, we are building upon the lighted thoughts generated at the Geneva and London seminars, which took place earlier today. One of the speakers was Dan Wheatley, a senior diplomat for the Baha'i community in the UK, influencing government policies on human rights and social issues. So it's wonderful for us to have Liliana Nkunzimana here, As the Baha'i representative at the New York Community UN office, Lilian is co-chair of the New York Peacebuilding Group, and her work includes serving on the NGO Committee on the Status of Women. And we are also fortunate to have with us today Dr. Andrew Strauss, who brings his extensive knowledge and experience of international law and human rights. His involvement in the Global Governance Forum's second UN Charter initiative will also add to the vision for rights international relations we are going to discuss today. And while Goodwill's vision is a spiritual and philosophical one, seeking to influence thinking by working with subtle energies in meditation, to inspire and empower world servers working for the upliftment of human consciousness. The will needs to be mobilized to achieve this beneficent purpose, for the will is a dynamic power in governance, politics, and law. And all who think in terms of the one humanity and the one life, and who strive to exemplify goodwill, can together become responsive to this dynamic energy and transmit goodwill into responsive hearts and minds. When we consider the fractious state of international relations in today's world, it's not easy to remain positive. The Geneva Academy website lists 110 armed conflicts that are currently taking place globally. With 45 countries, the Middle East tops the list involved in some form of armed conflict. So humanity clearly has a long history of wars, amply demonstrating the habit of crisis in the evolution of humanity's consciousness. The world has been transformed in many remarkable ways since the Second World War. But we now witness the proliferation of low-intensity conflicts, the characteristics of the new wars, as Mary Calder, a professor of global governance, terms them. They include fighting in the name of identity politics as opposed to ideology, attempts to achieve political rather than physical control of the population through fear, as well as conflict financed not by the state, but by other predatory means that seek the continuation of violence. In her view, these new types of war can only be tackled by policy responses established on a global basis, and therefore by global governance. But the pivotal crisis concerns the changing nature of the nation state. So while war has previously been seen as the ultimate exercise of a nation's power, the relationship between state power and violence is rapidly changing. In an interconnected, technologically driven world, new resources are increasingly available to all for both good and evil uses. In this era of post-truth politics, the electronic media and worldwide communication networks provide a battlefield for a war of words that is playing out. And it's more important than ever to understand the true nature of power as described by the political philosopher Hannah Arendt. Power is actualized only where word and deed have not parted company, where words are not empty and deeds not brutal, where words are not used to veil intentions, but to disclose realities, and deeds are not used to violate and destroy, but to establish relations and create new realities. So on the positive side of things, the power of words and their current misuse in national and international affairs has seen the global civil society raise its voice exponentially. We've seen the rise of new types of parliamentary assemblies to help re-establish the root meaning of Parliament, which is to talk, and to talk with honesty and conviction in the context of a fledgling global society. In other words, to talk with the power of goodwill. The number of these international parliamentary assemblies is growing. For example, the Asian Parliamentary Assembly seeks to promote peace in general and in the Asian region in particular. Then there's the Pan-African Parliamentary Assemblies, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, the Euro-Latin American Parliamentary Assembly, which bolsters EU-Latin American relations. And this is just to name a few. These parliamentary unions have typically been formed to represent citizens more than governments. And the majority have no legislative power, nor do they hold direct elections. But their deliberations on high ideals represent the best that is in humanity and the guarantee of a better future. With the growth of these parliamentary institutions, rare before the 1990s, is a significant development in world affairs. It parallels the rise of global civil society. The growth of these parliamentary institutions has been largely unnoticed by the general public and often surprisingly under the radar of political science too, I believe. It's interesting that the International Parliamentary Union, formed as long ago as 1889, was instrumental in setting up a permanent court of arbitration in The Hague, as well as laying the foundations for the creation of the League of Nations and its successor, the United Nations. And it is now a global organization of 179 national parliaments, promoting peace, democracy, and sustainable development. And it's been put forward by some as the natural forerunner to a world parliamentary assembly, with its home at the United Nations. And a development of this kind would be another milestone on the path towards international unity, provided the free will and self-determination of nations is not threatened. Rather, it will depend on the natural ability of people within the assemblies to think in the light of judicial reasoning, as it has been referred to in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, and to manifest it through skill in action, as Lord Krishna defines yoga in the Bhagavad Gita. So these assemblies provide a noteworthy counterbalance to the human atrocities and infringements on civil liberties occurring around the world at this time. They provide us with an opportunity to think high and to think big. But of course, much more importantly, every person of goodwill has a powerful influence subjectively on the state of the world through right thinking and harmlessness. As Albert Einstein famously stated, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. And this suggests that we have to invoke to evoke, to be receptive to ideas from higher realms of wisdom, as they are vital to rethinking international relationships and progressing inwardly to a new and shared reality. Today we celebrate continental unions, intergovernmental organizations, global civil society groups, and perhaps most significant of all, the rise of over 10 million non-governmental organizations. Many of these groups today are known as social profit organizations, which seems far more representative of the dynamic goodwill they express. Considering the sheer number and range of problems that all these groups address, it's clear their potential for good is enormous. And while there's some way to go, the vision of shared responsibility and oneness is dawning on the collective consciousness. And the goal towards cooperation and synthesis is being held before us in the spiritual principles embodied in the UN Charter and in plans to realize changes within the structures of the UN that will align with this increasing enlightenment. It's a forum where we can learn to value others despite outer differences and the veils of language, religion, and culture. We are approaching a time when we can perceive the divinity inherent within the whole and the unity within diversity. For humanity is more important than nations, just as its inner splendor is more than its outer form. So before hearing from my colleague, Michael Galloway, in discussion with Dr. Andrew Strauss, let's pause and then say together the affirmation of the will on the screen. The triangle divine is a symbol of the soul or spirit, and the square symbolizes humanity. In the center of the will of God I stand. Naught shall deflect my will from his. I implement that will by love. I turn towards the field of service. I, the triangle divine, work out that will within the square and serve my fellow men. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. Lovely intro. So I'd like to now invite Andrew Strauss. Andrew Strauss, I see you're already there. Dr. Andrew Strauss, welcome. Just a bit of background on Andrew before we jump in. Andrew Strauss is a world-renowned expert in international law. His areas of expertise are public international law, international economic law, international transactions, international organizations. He has served most recently as the Dean of the University of Dayton Law School. He has also served as a Fulbright Scholar in Ecuador, where he studied tribal politics in the Amazon. He has taught Singaporean constitutional law at the National University of Singapore, and he has been a lecturer at the European Peace University in Schleining, Austria. He has served as the director of the Geneva-Lausanne International Law Institute and the Nairobi International Law Institute. In 2006, he delivered the Henry Usborne Memorial Lecture in the British House of Parliament, and he has conducted human rights missions to Asian countries and has been a consultant to both Human Rights Watch and Human Rights First. So a very, very full resume there. Andrew, we're really, really grateful to have you with us. It's really a privilege. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Michael. I'm very happy to be here.
Excellent. And so I was just going to preface for the audience, our discussion today, and I was like, well, it'd be helpful if we had like a title or a theme or a topic or something. And then, you and I were discussing in advance, we parsed out some questions, and I just kept thinking, wow, this is such a large topic we're discussing here. The idea of the moral good, the will aspect, what that means and the way that influences the way we think about international relationships in the context of everything going on in the world today. Also the breadth of your expertise. And so I decided not to try to put a name on it, and I think we'll just go through and let the audience get sort of a sense that way of all the ideas we're going to introduce today. The topic also, I think one of the things we'll be focusing on, I think, which was obvious in Chris's introduction as well, is the role that spirituality plays in this whole question as well, which is, it's very much a global question. It's very much a mundane question in many ways, but it's also just as fundamentally a spiritual question. So I think that may be, so with that in mind, maybe you could start by just maybe telling us a little bit about yourself, what motivated you maybe to pursue a career in international law, and how this has propelled you throughout your career.
So, well, thank you, Michael. And it's really a real pleasure to be here. I feel very much drawn towards the message of this seminar and of the Lucis Trust, and just listening to Christine Morgan, I felt like very much of a fellow traveler with all of you. I started in international law, I guess. In some ways, I would say the germ of my interest in international law started as a child, really. My own family background is that my father's family were caught up, were German Jewish, and so in the 1930s were caught up in the Holocaust and the turmoil that was going on. My father was a refugee. And growing up in the 1960s and 70s, it wasn't talked about all that much, but it really weighed on the environment, I think. And I can remember as a little kid reading, I don't know, I was 9 or 10 years old, probably. I don't know, maybe a little older. And I remember reading All Quiet on the Western Front, that famous book about, the horror of World War I. And as I had a sense like things are not okay, at a very young age, that there's something wrong with the global environment. And in the kind of naivete that a child has, it was like, this can't be right. If we should be able to will it differently. I didn't understand a lot of the intricacies of global politics and all of that. It was just like, somehow this should be different. And I think that is some sort of sense of that is what propelled me towards international law. I remember well, actually, I was looking a few years ago just through papers, and I found my old law school application to NYU, and I talked actually about wanting to be involved in working on new institutions to create a more harmonious global order, and all of that sort of thing. And I was like, wow, with all the twists and turns that my career has taken, doubts and all sorts of things, I've actually done that. I was like, you write these essays, you're trying to impress the admissions officers and so forth. But I was really sort of interested in the extent to which, at some level, something was guiding me to sort of pursue this idea of trying to find a more harmonious global architecture. So I think this sense of that something was really wrong and needed to be corrected at the global level. And I think also international law really just appealed to me intellectually. I often tell my students that one of the exciting things about international law is that we're founding parents of the evolving international system. If you study tax law, that system is pretty well developed. But we're really trying to form a new system in many ways, since we're existing in sort of a half-life between power politics and rule of law. And that really appealed to me intellectually. And I guess the final thing I would say that really appealed to me about international law was when I was getting into it in the early days, I had a tremendous amount of wanderlust, and I wanted to travel. And so it was a great way of experiencing different places in the world, getting to know people from all over, and getting to know different cultures and all of that. So I would say that was really how I initially got into law. It's not always easy, for sure, but I'm very happy with more years behind me in my career than in front of me that I chose this career path.
Thank you, Andrew. It's really interesting to hear that sort of. I don't know if it was this seminar that evoked you to go back and look at those old applications or not, but it just sort of an observation. It's something about. Maybe we'll get to more of this later, but it's this idea of really what is moral power. And if you sort of look at this spiritually, at least at the trust, we say this has to do basically in humanity as with the soul, basically, and what that is. And it's interesting how we see, the naivety of youth, and but also there's the wisdom of youth at the same time. And there's something so special about, I think, something at the beginning of our adult lives, when there's that sort of deep innate intention to the good. Something somehow it's just so pure, and the fact that you've been able to recognize that and sort of see it through is really highlights that in a really marvelous way, I think.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So just to pivot, your interest in spirituality, I understand, is very aligned with World Goodwill. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about this interest and how it connects with what you do with international law.
Yes, absolutely. So I grew up in a pretty secular environment. Not a lot of discussion about spirituality or sort of ritualistic religious sort of practices were somewhat of a part of it, but there wasn't really much about spirituality. And I've always, from the time, again, when I was young, I had some kind of interest, but it was pretty unformed. I think that interest, after I graduated, I went to Princeton, and I got a Fulbright, as you mentioned, actually, in your introduction, to study the role of evangelical missionaries among indigenous people in the Amazon. And I chose that because I was really interested in learning, to a great extent. I was interested in learning about indigenous religion, Native American religion, and also Christianity. And so it gave me an opportunity to do that. And I spent a good deal of time when I was down in Ecuador, where it was, in the Amazon. And in those days, this was 1981. There, of course, weren't cell phones and the internet, and it was pretty remote. There were even areas which had been very, very sparsely contacted by the outside world. And it was several days. You'd go by dugout canoe into these different areas. And there was something about the environment where there wasn't all this sensory stimulation. And it was just much more elemental and quiet, and people didn't move so quickly. And things began to come in. What I've later come to realize were kind of mystical religious experiences. I had absolutely no context. And it really woke me up as like, wait a minute, there's something else going on here, other than just the things that take place in what in Vedic philosophy they talk about as the gross realm. And I remember I got back to Quito, and I had a friend who told me about William James's famous book, The Varieties of Religious Experiences. And I read the book and I was like, wow, so this is what this is all about. And I was really, really interested. I then went to law school, which didn't really further this very much, actually. But I made a real commitment to myself that I was going to pursue this. And after law school, I got a job teaching at as mentioned, I taught at the National University of Singapore. And I used that as an opportunity to really go traveling around Asia. I took 6 months after my gig in Singapore ended and went to India. It was kind of a pilgrimage, and visited with yogis and that sort of thing. And eventually I wound up in Wat, a Thai temple, where they taught Westerners Vipassana meditation. And I spent over a month there. And it was really, for the first time, I was like, wow, this is really what I've been looking for. And in my world, if you were trying to deal with emotional or psychological or spiritual issues, the only thing I knew that people did was they could go, if they were troubled enough, to some sort of mental institution. And the idea that there were actually places where you could go do this was amazing to me. And so I've been pursuing meditation ever since. I stepped down from the deanship in the end of last year, and I'm on sabbatical right now, and I've done 3 meditation retreats actually this period. So it's been tremendously important in my life, and I would say the connection to international law is, to me, spiritual growth is really a kind of decentering, that we start out, I think, and this is normal and natural, I think, is we start out seeing everything through, our own view, our own perspective, our own thoughts. And that's very, very sort of egocentric, that we're the center of everything. Or, we might grow out of that and see everything through our community, our ethnic group or something. And through various types of religious practices, and for me in particular, meditation, you can start to see that you're not your thoughts, that you're not your body, that there is an awareness that houses all that there's something bigger than all of that, and that you're a part of that. You're not everything. And then when you can see that the world community is also inside of this kind of broader frame, and the earth and the universe as a whole, that it's all housed inside something bigger. And you can see that ideas and thoughts and everything emerge within that you're not the be all and end all. Then you have a bigger frame. And with that bigger frame, it really lends itself to seeing things in that kind of way. And the global system, and trying to create a more harmonious global system, is part of that, rather than just being ethnocentric and thinking my nation state system is the absolute and all we need to think about. So I think they're very, very connected together. That would be my best way of trying to say it.
That's wonderful, Andrew. Thank you for that. It's so what I'm hearing, it definitely is very aligned with world goodwill, and in almost totally, I would say. There's this thing about really seeing clearly, that changes much more than just, it can really change us so fundamentally. So to me, it's this thing about like the way we view through basically what a lot of spiritual traditions would call Maya, or illusion, that this sort of, and of course we have many different layers of that, and we all are familiar with some of them, I think, but it's, yeah, I mean, it's all a process, of course, as well. So, which brings me to, just moving forward, my next question, which is, how do you see this sort of the potential in that spiritual orientation, which to me is a clear vision, but you also described it, much more comprehensively than that. How is this sort of spiritual orientation a factor in our effort to establish a global and harmonious order?
Yes, I think that's really an important question. That I think that sort of one's perspective on religion makes a huge difference, right? If your orientation is, you're sort of in a place where you're seeing things through your own lens, and you're not able to see that there's this broader spiritual reality that's bigger than you are, or your community is, then you're going to naturally see the world in a very sort of divisive way, that, it's us against them. And it's, I think, and of course we're seeing a lot of that, and a lot of those symbols are used oftentimes by people very opportunistically to gain power and to divide people up and to dominate other people. And I think that beginning to make this connection, that there is this broader reality, and not just intellectually. I mean, it's helpful to do it intellectually and to realize that we're all part of something, but to actually experience ourselves within this broader context, to have a felt experience that there is a consciousness or a dharma or a God that's bigger than our own parochial selves, is going to manifest itself in everything we do, and particularly, I think, in how we create political structures and global political. And one of the things I think in a very practical way that hopefully is beginning to take place is that people that are beginning to see this on a really large scale. And I do think there is a lot going on. I think your organization is a good example of something that I do think is emerging in the body politic. And you're probably really, your organization is probably at the leading edge of this. Because most people that have this sense of what I'm talking about have not really connected it politically. You know, they talk about that they're, you know, a common way of sort of getting at this is people that say, well, I'm spiritual, but not religious. And there's people in the West that might delve into Eastern religious ideas or go to yoga or go to meditation. But it's largely pretty inchoate. It's not really connected to politics, where more ethnocentric and nationalistic ideas, as we know, there's all of these religious movements that are very ethnocentric, very nationalistic, and they are manifesting themselves politically. So I would say the real challenge for all of us is beginning to find that connection between this kind of spiritual vision and really turning it into a political movement. And I think there is among the people, people can say later on when there's audience interaction whether this resonates or not. But I think there is a tremendous need and desire for so many people to have a positive vision that comes out of our sense of shared humanity, that comes out of the idea that we are in this together and we can create structures which represent that. And those have not yet gotten there. It hasn't yet gelled in a way where this vision has a political arm to it that's able to present this to people around the world. And I think when that key is put in that lock, it will unlock tremendous, tremendous energy. And that I really see as the challenge and really what you all are trying to do. So I'm tremendously, as I said, I'm tremendously happy to be here participating.
Thank you, Andrew. Would you say, just to follow up on that, would you say that that bridging is perhaps between the intellect and the sort of higher sort of meaning-making faculty of what we might call the soul or the higher mind or something like that?
Well, I definitely think that that is an important bridge.
Mhm.
It's not exactly the bridge that I think I'm talking about, Michael, but I think it's such an important bridge is that, yes, you know, all truths can be arrived at in a variety of different ways. So you can intellectually sort of understand that we're all united and we're all connected and that you can't figure everything out intellectually. There's something bigger there. But there's also like a felt sense, a spiritual way of understanding. So to connect the intellectual and the felt sense, I think it's very and that's what I think you're referring to. The connection I'm making is turning that into almost institutionalizing, having people who are going to their yoga class and have some sort of sense of this actually join you know, the Lucis Trust and get involved in taking political action, which really represents this. And that connection hasn't really so much happened.
I see what you mean. Yeah, yeah. Speaking of institutionalization, though, I just keeping an eye on our time, and actually quite a bit of time has already passed amazingly somehow. But I just want to pivot now to a question that's perhaps a bit, in some ways, a bit more mundane, but also a bit more important. I think not more important, but it's also very important. So, what role does international law play in all of this?
So, to me, international law is this manifestation, in a way, of our consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I always tell my students in class that the global system, the classic global system, is based around the core principle really is national sovereignty, which is that nation states are ultimate and supreme, and they only have to follow the international rules. For anybody who knows anything about international law, who's on the call, they only have to follow the international rules that they agree to, that they consent to. And so that's a manifestation of a certain kind of understanding. And if enough people begin to understand that, the nation state isn't ultimate and supreme, really. I mean, from what I would myself understand is a spiritual sense, that yes, the nation state is a certain unit of political authority that we've created, made up this unit, but it makes a certain amount of practical sense in the everyday world, and it makes sense to do certain things at the national level. It makes sense to do certain things at the local level. But it also makes sense to do certain things at the international level, not to give total primacy to our own sense of national identity. And so that's where these things really translate. So international law, though, is an attempt now to begin, those of us working in the field, to transcend this idea that the be all and end all is the nation state, and say we are also a global community. We're a national community, but we're a global community. And we need to learn how to do things at the global level in a cooperative way, and not say that any individual state could be totally antisocial and say, I'm going to opt out of that. Just as in any community, we don't say that anybody can do whatever. So I think it's a manifestation of trying to really recognize our shared humanity that comes out of these kinds of insights.
So would you say that international law is perhaps the impartial arbiter between this basic tension between national consciousness and international consciousness?
It is representing, I don't know whether it's an impartial arbiter, but it's representing both right now.
I meant potentially, sorry. I meant like potentially.
Yeah, yes, I think that it is the place where many people, such as all of you and listening to Christine's talk, it's the place where many people that have a shared vision of a common human family are coming together to try and make that happen. Mm-hmm. And so I do think that's part of it. Of course, you have nation states that are very powerful, just pursuing national interest as well, but they're coming together to negotiate it out with other nation states. And so we're in this, there's a lot of tensions between the parochial and the universal. And some of that is actually healthy, but if it's balanced, and I think that's what you're getting, if there's a balance.
Thank you. Yeah, exactly. It sort of brings us to my next question, just moving along here about your work with the global parliaments, which Christine also mentioned in her introductory talk. Can you tell us a little bit about this project and why you think it's important?
Yes, this has been probably my most important project throughout my career. Richard Falk and I started doing this in the 1990s. And basically, the proposal that we've been trying to work towards has been to have a parliament at the global level that would be modeled on the European Parliament. And Christine was very helpful in pointing out all the other parliaments that in the years that we've been doing this have begun to emerge globally with different international organizations. But the idea, for those of you who are not familiar with the European Parliament is directly elected by all the citizens of the European Union. It started life as an advisory body and with very, very limited powers. And I think that's how we would have to start a global parliament at this point, is that it would have to almost for sure have advisory powers, and that governments would not be likely to see major decision making. Maybe not all countries would be members in the early days. Maybe some countries, as Christine was saying, that would be members would not allow elections initially. Maybe their parliaments would elect representatives. But eventually, the organization could grow over time as the only citizen representative and hopefully directly elected body on the international level. Just having the elections, the press would cover them. They would have a high level of visibility. Their resolutions would carry a high level of legitimacy. And the idea is that in a parliament, the representatives don't represent their countries. So you could have, hopefully, eventually, certainly, Chinese liberals teaming up with Indian liberals, teaming up with American liberals, and Chinese conservatives teaming up with Indian conservatives and American conservatives, and not even the same on every issue. You could have shifting and unarmed coalitions, just like happens in national parties. And those coalitions, unlike the way representatives work today in global governments, would not be backed by armies, would not be backed by a sense of national identity. They would just be based on interest and ideology. And if an organization like this began to come into being internationally, citizen groups would be involved in lobbying, analysts, labor unions, corporations, and you'd have a whole sphere where directly different groups could find accommodations, work with each other, work with their representatives. And over time, as we began to have a civil space such as this, global order, hopefully could develop an alternative kind of politics that would make people less afraid and less reliant on armies that are ultimately threatening to kill each other and more. So that's the vision of a global parliament. Obviously, these are challenging times for democracy, but my view is that, having another level of democracy strengthens democracy. I'm a believer even in, this fraught period. We have our own election in the United States in a few days. That, along with Winston Churchill, that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. And that we really need to figure out ways to strengthen it. And goodwill is super important to that. People really trying to think these kinds of systems. So that's the basic vision.
Thanks, Andrew. There's recently been, as some of our participants know, this big event at the UN called the Summit of the Future, which there was, in connection with that, a lot of reforms proposed to the pretty serious discussion about UN reform came up there. You were advisor or worked on a project with regard to it, what's called a second UN charter, which is a proposal for basically a new constitution or charter for the UN. And the idea of the global parliament actually made it into this charter.
Yes.
It's a pretty serious proposal, very, very serious document. I invite everybody on the call we don't really have time to go into it in too much depth, but anybody who would like to, I'll put the link in the chat momentarily. But just to conclude, I wanted to ask you, what do you think it means that this initiative, which you started, I think you said back in 1997, and which sort of wasn't so strongly talked about, though I'm sure there was still work being done on it for quite a few decades, has now come back full circle. What do you think that means for our present opportunity today?
I'm very encouraged. I'm very encouraged about the entire second charter movement. And I think that's very helpful, Michael, if you send that to people. It's more than, I'm very heartened personally that the parliament's in it, but there's far more than just the parliament in it. I mean, it's a bold proposal for UN reform, and the door really seems open. When we first started the parliamentary discussion in the 1990s, after the end of the Cold War, there was a kind of opening, actually. There was a lot of interest. And then after 9/11 and a lot of changes that took place, the door sort of shut. And I think now the door is open towards proposals again. Again, as Christine said, I think there's a sense that there's really a sense that the middle power countries can do much more, and that the global order is changing, like it or not, and that it's the time to seize the opportunity. So I think it's a very exciting time.
Mm-hmm.
There's foreign ministers that have joined the initiative, ambassadors, people that are in a position to really do quite a bit to forward it. So it's an exciting initiative to be.
Thanks. And though that would be a good note to end on, I just wanted to sort of follow up with one more question. But do you think, and within that, optimism is really important, because I agree it's a very hopeful time. Do you also see the potential, if this does start to go forward, say really seriously, for the intensification of crisis and discord around maybe resistance to something so maybe spiritually consequential as well? And what do you think about that?
Absolutely. I mean, everything is so complex, and there is always the law of unintended consequences, and it's just very hard to predict it. We are in an extremely period, politically. I was just reading, right before coming on about the Iranian government talking about further retaliation against the Israelis. And, the world order is in a very, very precarious situation right now. And having something like this, who knows how it all comes out in the mix. So, it's definitely a possibility. There would be a strong reaction against this by many quarters. There's absolutely no doubt about it. I feel like we need to plow ahead. We need to keep our eyes on what's important. We may achieve these things in the near term. It may be a longer term. There may be real setbacks. But I don't think we have the luxury of just saying, well, there could be a reaction, so we're not going to do it. It could be destabilizing. There's no doubt about it. You have to recognize that and go forward. I'm a reader of some of the existentialists. And, Martin Heidegger talked about thrownness, that we're all just thrown into the world. And we don't really have the option of not doing anything. So we have to do the best we can do. And to do nothing is to do something. So we do the best we can do, and that's it. And you have to let the results at some level go. So that would be my answer.
Thank you, Andrew. That was just a marvelous, marvelous statement there, and I think it's a really good note for us to close on. For now, because we will have our next speaker is going to come on, but then we will have the two of you together for a panel right after that. And we'll also bring an audience Q&A as part of that. So we will have more time to hear from you. And the audience will also have an opportunity to ask you questions then. So if anybody on the call does have questions, for Andrew, you can just jot them down and we'll follow them up later. So thank you so much, Andrew.
Thanks so much, Michael.
Yeah. So now I'd like to invite Stephen Nation and Liliana Nkunzimana. Excellent. And so I will now pass it over to Steve.
Thank you, Michael. Can you hear me okay? Working okay?
Yes, hear you well. Yeah.
Good show. So that was wonderful session with Andrew, and that's really prepared us really beautifully, I think, for this time to meet Liliana Nkunzimana. Liliana, we're so grateful to you for taking the time to be with us. Andrew's been involved is more my sort of generation. Liliana represents a new generation. That's part of the delight for me of having you with us today, but also that you're deeply involved and have been deeply involved for some time in the interaction between civil society and between vision and processes at the United Nations. So you have a lot of experience in that. You represent the Baha'i International Community's UN office in New Zealand, in New York. God, that shows it. Do please excuse me. In New York, United States. Your areas of work include gender equality and peace. And it's just interesting to think, you imagine now this large community of people all around the world whose lives now are deeply involved in the sort of muscular work of bringing about recognition of human rights, the rights of all people, through gender issues and also through peace building. So from the local, national, and global level. So in a way, Liliana, you represent this big community, muscular community of human beings whose concern for vision is being applied in a life that's dedicated to service. You're currently on the NGO Committee on the Status of Women, and you're co-chair of the New York Peace Building Group. You've been a co-chair of the Communications Task Force of the Global Coalition on Youth, Peace and Security. So, Liliana, welcome. Earlier today on the London call, we had Dan Wheatley, who's a representative of the Baha'i community in UK. So it's rather lovely that we have quite a strong Baha'i presence in this conversation today. And Dan made the point that today is a twin holy day for you and for the whole Baha'i community, which is about 8 million people. I mean, Baha'i community is a large community. So tell us a little bit about yourself, about your association with the Baha'i community, with the Baha'i faith, and sort of maybe how and why that involves you in United Nations things, United Nations topics.
Thank you so much, Steve, for inviting me, and also to Liz Strauss for organizing this really important conversation. It's so lovely to see so many people here engaging in this global conversation. And it's nice to hear you mention New Zealand. We do have a wonderful Baha'i community in New Zealand, and the Baha'i international community, of course, represents a global community of Baha'is in nearly every country, 180 countries and localities around the world. So it's a huge honor to be able to work at the BIC in the New York office and to be channeling the insights that are being generated globally by Baha'is in the activities that they're engaging in at the grassroots level and the national level. And we try to bring all of those insights into the work that we do. In terms of my own involvement, I was actually with a local community in Canada before I moved to New York to work at the BIC, and I think my experience is probably very similar to a lot of other Baha'is who are called upon to really be concerned with the well-being of the world. This is at the core of what it means to be a Baha'i, and so wherever Baha'is live, in whatever locality they're in, whether it be a city block or a village, or even within their work, really try to live this concern and the principles of the Baha'i faith and bring that into their friendships, into their family work, their family functioning, and into their work as well. So I think, as anybody, Baha'is are not perfect, but we're constantly trying to embody this posture of learning. So how can we day in, day out reflect on what we're doing, how we're living to live the Baha'i principles and bring those into our work. I'm very grateful for my upbringing. I have one Baha'i parent and one who's not a Baha'i, and so as part of that, I was raised with this strong belief that, of course, we have to respect the beliefs of others, because we all come into this world from different walks of life, and we have to respect that. But we also have to investigate for ourselves how we're going to live our own lives. And I was strongly encouraged to do that from a young age. And so I was influenced, of course, by the Baha'i faith because of the faith of my mother and my grandparents. But I feel very grateful for that principle of really investigating the truth for yourself. And I took that quite seriously. And so when I left home and went to school, I went to graduate school, I was always very curious about just ways of being and practicing and how I would live my life and what would be the compass that would guide my decision. And when I was in grad school, I decided to become a Baha'i. And so since then, really trying to understand what that means. And so that has led me to different opportunities and opportunities to serve. So I've lived in different countries. In Tanzania, I was at one point living in Haifa, serving with the Baha'i World Center there, and eventually was invited to serve with the Baha'i international community. So it's just been a journey of learning that I'm hoping will continue.
That's very lovely. That's such a, it's almost like, to me, a universal story now that something's happening in human beings. What I love about your story is about authenticity. And really this theme we have in international relations really is about, through crisis, and as Andrew just said, I mean, obviously we're going into crisis, but crisis brings opportunity. The UN itself was formed as a result of horrendous crisis and trauma. And to me now, part of the a way of understanding the present situation in the world and the crisis is that it is pushing more and more good people to take your journey and to discover who, look, really, as I move into adulthood, who am I and what is my purpose? And through this is where I think that to me is a central part of international relations, because it's as if consciousness is transiting. So a central core of your faith, of the Baha'i faith, which I would say certainly it's a central core of, well, Goodwill and Lucis Trust, but I think now of a significant number of people, is a belief in the oneness of humankind. The Baha'i faith has served that belief like in a really willful, strong way for a long period of time. And a part of, as I understand it, a part of Baha'u'llah's sort of revelation and his gift to the world is a call for the need for world government.
Mm-hmm.
We tend to talk now about global governance. Andrew talked about global governance, and if you look at conversations at the UN, they're all about global governance. How do you see the transition from the idea of global government to global governance?
Thank you so much for the question. A big question, of course,
Yeah.
a complicated one. One could probably write several books about that. So, I mean, yes, I think perhaps the reason why our conversations are confined to issues of global governance now, a lot of that has to do with readiness and preparation, and where we are as a humanity. And of course, it makes sense. I think that the very existence of the UN and the structures of global governance that we have today through various agencies and structures is a testament to how interconnected and interdependent we are. It cannot be denied that what happens in one corner of the world is going to affect another, and our lives are so intertwined. And so, of course, there have to be systems where and platforms where the representatives of the global population can come together and negotiate what that means and really deal with one another and think about how to allow for the flow of information, the flow of goods, and the flow of services. However, I think it would take a long time, and that there will have to be a deep, fundamental process of transformation and growth and maturity before humanity is able to have a global government. I think the very fact that we have a United Nations is a miracle. For anybody in this call who's had the honor and opportunity to go to the UN, whether it's in New York or other UN hubs, and sit in on some of these sessions where you watch the representatives of the member states negotiate with one another, literally sometimes over the place of commas and the use of individual words, that this is what the representatives of the peoples of the world are doing when they meet together. And so that we have a UN, that it functions, that we could have a summit of the future to think about the well-being of future generations and how we are taking care of our planet. Are we going to leave behind a planet where future generations can live and thrive? That is incredible, given the current situation of the world. But of course, because our conception of what it means to be a successful nation is still bound, it is still so immature in a way. It's bound up in how much we can accumulate and how much power we can preserve for ourselves as in the nation, as was mentioned by Professor Strauss in the earlier conversation, because the way that we organize ourselves and our affairs is still bounded up in those very small conceptions of power. Obviously, we have a long way to go, but I think anybody who looks at how rapidly we are growing as a humanity, the speed of technological advancement, and also if you look at the generation today, I look at my sisters and their friends who are much younger than me, and they're so concerned about how borderless our concerns are, you know? And so obviously in the future, the way that we govern ourselves will have to be much bigger than it is today. But it is going to be generational in nature, and we're not there yet, but we cannot stop it. That is the direction that we're going towards.
I sometimes think that your work with the Baha'i community's work and its history of working with the idea of the oneness of humanity in those early days was such a far-off vision. Today, in human thought, it's been like a revelation. I sort of do believe in a divine, and I thought Andrew described it actually rather beautifully, that there's something greater. And what's happening in consciousness it's actually an aspect of intuition, I would say, that there's a growing, somehow human consciousness is beginning to establish a relationship with this whole of life as a being, with universal truth, love, and principles that we're all a part of. And a part of our crisis is that that's an incredible revelation. And that takes time. It takes, as you say, generations to work out. And to me, one of the things that, so maybe people on this call, and certainly a lot of, like the people where I live, miss, is a realization that in the halls of the UN, and just endless conferences around the world, not necessarily with UN, but that are global, in every profession, every field of life, there are these deep conversations going on about how we relate the separateness enshrined in, say, national sovereignty with the fact that our environment, everything about our lives is interdependent. It's and through generations, to me, the most positive, it's not just hope, it's just a seeing things really as they are, this is the first time the human community has ever been pushed into this realization that we're interdependent, and that we have to bring a higher moral thing that we can find within us. It's actually closer than our heart. It's within us. The international community and your work through the international community is so closely involved with UN processes, and that's something that, like I think the whole of World Goodwill has terrific respect for. The investment just in terms of time, energy, and consciousness in engaging in the process. So, and there's a couple of things I wanted to say. First of all, and I'll put in the chat later, the statement that the international community made for the Summit of the Future on embracing interdependence, because it's such a clear, well thought through sort of legal principles, stating how what is needed is an entirely new principle around which the nations of the world can begin to learn, even just take steps to learn to cooperate. And as it brings up what Andrew said, the need to move from national sovereignty to a recognition of oneness. really. And I really recommend that people look at that, and I'll put a link in the chat when there's time later on. But could you tell us a little about your own engagement with some of the conversations that you were involved with during the Summit of the Future that might give our participants in this call some sense of like the depth of thought that is actually now present, particularly in civil society, but also I'm bringing in some UN people. Like our London conference had a wonderful little segment of Mia Motley speaking at the end of the action days. So also in government, this new spirit is present, and to me, Amina Mohammed sometimes brings that through in too. And maybe you could tell us a little about some of the meetings and some of the conversations that the Baha'i community and you were involved with during the Summit of the Future.
Thank you, Steve, for expressing appreciation for the work of the BIC. And it's always encouraging when people recognize the work that's being done and find it useful. You know, I think that's really the high aspiration, that the things that our office does, that they're actually out there and being used and providing assistance to others. You know, when this whole process started, it was about 3 years ago. The UN was at its 75th birthday, and the nations of the world came together and looked at the state of the world and recognized that the multilateral order is in peril. And I think any conscientious observer of the world looking at how we are relating to one another would have come to the same realization that the way that we are conducting ourselves is not, it will not lead to good results if we continue in the same way. So the member states turned to the Secretary General and asked him to write a report about the state of the world and what to do about it. So the Secretary General, a year later, released the Our Common Agenda report. And in that document, it's very long, if you have the patience to look through it. But right away, when that report came out, a number of organizations, including the Baha'i International Community, analyzed it and went through it and saw the recommendations that he was making. There were about 90 plus recommendations on how to go about adjusting and fixing the multilateral order so we can really fix our relations with one another, especially on the global stage. And so as part of this, the SG made a number of recommendations for the nations of the world to come together around a number of summits to think about different issues. There was a summit around the transformation of education, and I highly recommend people to look at the UNESCO reports that were written about that, because actually they're very much aligned with this idea of how do we incorporate, it's not stated as spiritual, but when I read those documents, I see how it is clearly trying to integrate spiritual principles into how we're educating future generations. And there was a call for a Summit of the Future to think about our multilateral system. And there was also a call for organizing a second World Social Summit to think about how we're meeting how we can fix the global social safety net, and that's going to be taking place next year. So these 3 big summits that were called for by the Secretary General, and we just finished that second summit earlier this year in September at the General Assembly. And so about 3 years ago, a number of civil society organizations were coming together to think about, okay, if this is what the SG has recommended, what is it that we need to do to support the member states to engage in this process? Because as you can imagine, the world isn't going to stop so that the member states can prepare for the summit. Global crises continued and still continue to take place because we're not adjusting our behavior as fast as we should. And of course there was a certain level of skepticism for the the motivation behind some of these summits that was being called. And I think that's because rightfully so, people are not trusting of world governments to have their best interest at heart because they have not behaved as such. However, as the Baha'i international community, our posture is always, if there's a global process that's taking place and that has the potential to offer a step in the right direction, we have an obligation and a responsibility to contribute to that process with as much effort and to offer as the lessons that we have learned as a global community towards this process as much as we can. We believe this is as our responsibility. So as part of that, we have been organizing, we organized these monthly gatherings around different aspects of the Our Common Agenda report, and we called them the Road to the Summit. So we were paving a pathway towards the Summit of the Future. And these gatherings were quite incredible, I have to say, because initially people weren't quite sure what was the purpose of coming together. These what's the purpose? Because the world's governments are irresponsible anyway. But what we were suggesting was, regardless of the global situation, the UN community is composed of incredible people with capacity. And so we should be coming together, sitting at the same table, member states, UN agencies, and civil society, and engaging in meaningful conversation. That there is value in all of us coming together to consult and to putting the best of our intellectual capacity towards thinking about the Summit of the Future. So that's what we did. And that all culminated at the General Assembly with this call for optimism. Because we came to the realization that there are a number of experts within the UN community who are experts in disarmament, there was this whole process of writing a second charter and so on. But what we thought our best contribution would be to say, okay, the world is in trouble, but we cannot solve this if we don't have a sense of optimism and a sense of hope towards this process. So we started asking people, every time, all of us, when we were in different meetings, we would ask, what gives you a sense of hope? And I clearly remember going to a meeting during the Summit of the Future when there was a whole conversation on climate change, and it was dire. It was and I said, we have to be realistic about the situation that we need. We don't want to be naive. But at the same time, if we become so engrossed in how horrible everything is, and we don't think about how, possibly, and Mary Robinson, the first woman president of Ireland, was there, and she always says, maybe our best days are ahead of us. And if we think that, we have to have a sense of hope and optimism that that's possible. So I asked the panel of speakers, like, what gives you a sense of optimism in your work? And you could see the atmosphere and the posture of the panelists changed, because it went from thinking about, oh my goodness, the world is about to end, to, oh, the reason why I'm doing this work is because I believe that we have the capacity to come up with solutions. So a lot of our work has always been, we have to engage in the process. We have to be aware of the reality that we're in. But we also have a responsibility to inject these processes and these conversations with a sense of some kind of positive attitude, because we're human beings. And I think it's basic psychology that the best of us comes out when we are in this posture of really deeply believing that we have the capacity to come together and to propose solutions that will work.
That's truly wonderful. I really love that, particularly when you think that as Baha'is you come into that, you bring into that a sense of optimism that's rooted in an experience of the reality of oneness, as not just as a principle, but as the sort of guts of life. and the evolutionary sort of incredible challenge for the human as we begin to stand face to face, eye to eye with that reality, and then think, heavens, this is quite something. So, and when, like, the theme of this, our little time together today, is the will to good and reimagining international relationships. And just that story of your community, your faith, making the commitment to act over a long period so that you develop experience. And then all the other communities, the Global Governance Commission, the Future Studies, all the different groups in the Coalition for the UN We Choose, and then other groups as well, to me, they are the heart of the optimism. They're what show, because they show that there's a terrific community that are putting all their professional skills, all of their thinking into responding to this revelation of interdependence in today's world, and that's a terrific thing. Look, our time is up. You've done beautiful. You've done good. So, Michael, I'll pass back to you, and maybe if you and Andrew, if you can.
Yep. So we can have Andrew back as well.
Yeah.
So yeah. Thank you, Liliana, and thank you, Steve, as well. I mean, it was really marvelous, and I have a lot of thoughts and inspirations going on. But this and maybe we'll get to those, and hopefully, but more importantly, we want to hear from Liliana and Andrew, of course, moving forward.
And Chris, you're
Chris, I'm not sure Chris was going to come for this part. Of course, she's welcome to hop in. So Chris, you're of course welcome to hop in if you'd like and take part in the panel, because we do want to keep it somewhat informal. I have a few questions here prepared for you guys. Sorry, Chris, are you there?
Yes, thank you for the offer. I was going to do the next section with you, but if I think of something marvelous, I'll say so.
Perfect. Yes, just jump right in. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, we have a next plan, just it's sort of like a roundtable or a discussion with the two of you, Liliana and Andrew. And we have about 45 minutes for this session. We do want to reserve some of that time to bring in some audience Q&A as well. So yeah, great. Just to say, we'll focus. I think we've heard a lot of great ideas from the two of you, a lot of really, really beautiful and inspiring thoughts. To start, though, I'd like to pull it back really to our theme, which, to just restate it for our participants again, is the will to good, rethinking international relationships. And so this theme, really, what we're aiming to do today, of course, this is a very broad topic. What we're aiming to do with this seminar is really to throw some light on this question of really, what is the will to good? What does that even mean? What is moral power, moral direction? What does that mean when it comes to the international problem, the basic international problem of establishing right human relationships? And what role does human thinking play in that process? And so we're not trying to answer that question, of course. Literally, it's a much too big question for any one group or one. It's a question so tremendous. It's one humanity will be wrestling with for probably another millennia. Who knows, another century at least. And but yeah. So just to start us off, I'd like to pose to both of you to focus on this part of the theme about thinking and the way we think about international relationships. If you all could just maybe share with us how you think the way we think about international relationships has evolved over the last, say, 10 or 25 years to bring us to where we are today.
I'm happy to start, or to let Liliana take the first stab. Liliana?
Go ahead, Andrew. I can come in afterward.
Okay. Yeah, no, I'm happy to sort of talk about that. I think maybe one thing to say, Michael, which I wanted to focus on, hearing what Steve and Liliana had to say, but there were a whole stream of sort of questions in the comments. So I didn't have a chance to address any of those. But yeah, there were a couple on enforcement, and also on what, that the problem with international law is that it's not enforceable. People can do what they want, or states can do what they want. And also the question of, well, what can citizens do to participate? And I think these both go to this question of thought and the relationship of goodwill towards the international system, in the sense that I think to first talk about enforcement itself, in some ways you can sort of see that there's two ways to getting things accomplished in the international system. That one is, Mao Zedong famously said, power comes from the barrel of a gun, right? And that's one way, it's force. And you have to have hard power, hard enforcement to get regimes to follow international law. The other is sort of the path of goodwill. And I would refer to that as more legitimacy, that regimes that are not complying with community standards, community values, become more and more isolated because they're considered less and less legitimate. And if we can strengthen these institutions of legitimacy, which are really about thought and what people think rather than what they're forcing them to do, to the extent that those become stronger and stronger, the International Court of Justice, the United Nations for what it says, and that we create a politics along the lines of what I was talking about before around a global parliament or other institutions that are about civil discourse, that we actually institutionalize it, then those begin to prevail. We don't have to, a lot of times we do things because we think they're right and because we do have good. And so to the extent that we strengthen the institutions around all that, that becomes much stronger. And I think that also suggests the role that citizens can play. There's all sorts of things that people can do based on ideas. You can go to your people in Congress. You can get people need to understand that there's a different way of seeing things. These ideas that we're talking about are not really part of the popular political debate, as we know in our country, again, with the election coming up on Tuesday. But if various different things can be done, petitions, op-eds in newspapers, just discussions with friends, you all have an organization which really you could be participating in, thinking about, well, what are the best avenues for us to actually bring these ideas into the global consciousness more and more. So I think that's really the direction, is making ideas, as you're suggesting, more and more important. And I didn't really address your question about how ideas have changed in the last 25 years so much, but I'll leave it there because I'm really interested to hear what Liliana and others have to say.
It actually did address it, I think, actually pretty well. So thank you, Andrew.
Thank you so much for the question. It's, again, I was telling Steve when we were preparing for this call, some of the questions that you have prepared are tough ones, and I think that's good.
We're terrible.
No, it's good. We have to ask the very difficult questions. I mean, I was thinking about some of the things that Andrew mentioned about just how we think about power. And, we're still very much in a world where our conceptions of power are around how many armaments does a nation have, and how large is the economy and GDP. And so it's very much around this hard power, and nations strive to wield influence in their where they are and how much how dominant they can be over others. And if we think about, and this was very much the reality when the UN was formed in the aftermath of the Second World War, and actually was a very small number of nations that were, at least if you think about the number of nations that were colonized at the time, and the presence of empire was still very much the way that people thought of the world at the time. And if I think about the region where I'm from, I was born in Rwanda. The number of African countries that were at the UN was very small, right? And so the way that the world has transformed and changed since 1945, and the UN that the way the UN was formed, and the constraints that existed at the time, in order for the UN to exist, you had to have the victors of the Second World War with this veto power that continues to haunt the UN, and it was contested at the formation of the UN at the time. It continues to be contested. And I think it stays very much at the heart of why the UN cannot function to meet the needs of the world today. So if you think about how the world was, the reality of the world at the time, and the thinking of what it means to have power at the time, although it hasn't, I think, although it still is the reality of how we think about power, the reality has changed in that we're so interconnected and we're so aware that the way that the UN exists today is inadequate. We can see small changes today. So if you look at, for example, what happened last September at the UN, because of the geopolitical situation that we're in today, there are some nations that did not want the Pact for the Future to be realized. The member states were negotiating up until very late on Saturday before the pact was released the following day on the Sunday, and on the UN floor, when the document was being put before the member states. As a matter of fact, Russia stopped the proceedings and wanted to interrupt the pact for the future from being passed. And it was the African nations, and it was the Republic of Congo that said, no, this is not going to happen, and raised a no action motion and stopped the whole conversation, and the Pact for the Future was passed. So if you look at 1945, handful of African nations that were there, critical number, and then you come to 2024, and the multilateral system is in tatters. People don't feel very hopeful, but then the African nations come together and they say, no, we believe in multilateralism. We want to see this process move forward. And now we have a pact for the future. And it was this group of nations that came together and really pushed this process to the very end. So the soft power that this group of nations now has, and it really actually, to me, reflects the consciousness of the world, because in the Pact for the Future, there's this reference to the historical injustice that has been made towards African nations. The only region that does not have any kind of, there's no one country from that region that has a veto on the Security Council. And of course, it's going to take a long time for that to change. But you can see that I would say moral stain on the UN, represented with this group of nations who are saying we of course the multilateral order as it stands today is not adequate, but we need it, and really push for this document to move forward. And it's now going to be the platform on which we can continue to have conversations about how are we going to fix the global situation. So I think the thinking around how we see the world has changed. It's just our systems have been caught up. But I really believe that they will.
It's interesting too that enforcement, in a way, thank God, say even the UN system doesn't have powers of enforcement, because right now the consciousness, just our humanness, is not ready for enforcement, because that sense of sovereignty of the one humanity is not livingly present. Therefore, enforcement would be rather dangerous, because you might like it. Well, if you don't like it, tough luck. But to me, one of the issues is that there is this optimism that you speak of, Liliana, And what you represent, Andrew, with the Global Governance Forum and all the other, the different future studies groups, but all the other huge professional bodies with significant academic presence, are actively engaged in this building of the new consciousness that does reflect human unity. I think that story about the defeat, the attempt to end the Pact of the Future and the sort of overwhelming rejection of that is one example of the sort of conscience speaking. The other one that to me is almost more powerful is this process that was used to determine the Sustainable Development Goals. And the thing that particularly always touches me about that, sort of like a miracle to me, how every government was one seat voting on the Sustainable Development Goals represented, say, 3 governments or 2 governments. Some of those partnerships were remarkable. So India and Pakistan, 2 sort of, you would say, enemy countries. They're often in, occasionally it comes out in conflict, but they're not brothers, had one vote on the Sustainable Development Goals. And there were other partnerships bringing together countries of the North and countries of the South. And out of all of that, it's a slightly materialistic perspective on interdependence, but still the goals resonate with this higher divine, this intuitive sense of wholeness that's coming into consciousness. And that's what should give us hope. It takes as long as it takes because it takes generations. But these stories of what happens at the UN or what happens at, like, this coming month is an international cooperative conference of cooperative movements. So now every movement in the world that's working for conscience and for a new relationship is global. Like and so a different one culture, maybe an indigenous, or maybe some small group that has a particular story to tell that resonates, will transform the sort of quality of discussion at a conference. So in law, non-stop. One of the things that I'm interested in doing is just looking at global conferences every month. And, you know, who would think that International Association of Judges meet? So judges, and that represents, if you look at different concepts of law, not just Western law, but indigenous law. Sometimes my own country is starting to really deeply look at law in terms of indigenous, local law, indigenous law, and more Western approaches to law. So this is a part of our experience today, I think.
I would just sort of like to put a plug in really for what Steve is saying. I mean, it is very easy to feel incredibly discouraged about the situation right now. The loudest voices in the global order today seem to be in many ways the most destructive voices. We're seeing almost a return to 19th century power politics, countries invading other countries. Much of the progress that I think many of us had hoped that we had made looks like it's being potentially reversed. But, you know, we really don't understand very much of what's going on. You know, we try and put a political science gloss and say, well, this trend is going in this direction, this trend is going in that direction. But our ability to know this is really, really limited. And, you know, none of us could have predicted the fall of the Berlin Wall. None of us could have predicted that one man self-emulating would spur the Arab Spring. You know, and for that matter, nobody predicted sort of the rise of the ethno-nationalism that is running rampant around the world. And so a lot of the things that you all are working on and that may not have captured the mass consciousness yet, they may be just around the corner. They may not be, but it's really unfathomable at some level. And I think, again, we all just have to do what we can do. And it may take, generations and generations, and maybe we'll have a kind of rapid breakthrough. In evolutionary science, they talk about, punctuated evolution, where all of a sudden there will be a big advance. And I think that's always possible. And again, we have no choice but to sort of plow through.
And, Eastern sort of traditions speak about even spiritual growth of the individual consciousness in terms of initiations, breakthroughs. And to me, if you look at humanity, the same story, because it happens in strange ways. In politics, sometimes, and I'm not referring to anything now, but sometimes it happens, someone dies, a leader dies, and for a short period of time, there's a vacuum. Stuff happens, like the end of the Cold War, and the most significant thing out of that was this series that transformed the UN. It had an incredible impact on conversations at the UN, and for the first time, the UN had always talked about these ideals, all sounds lovely, but for the first time, you had these conferences that really looked at, all right, take woman, the status of woman. Let's really think about, instead of just mouthing things, let's really think about what could happen. Conference on Women, the Social Summit, Conference on the Environment. And so these things of thought transformed the world. And it happened overnight.
Mm-hmm. No, I think you're both right in that, often it is in these situations where there seems to be intractable challenges that opportunity lies, and I'm thinking about, one of the really central key figures in the Baha'i faith talks about how there are really two ongoing simultaneous processes that we're witnessing. There's a process of disintegration where we see the world is falling apart and the evidence is clear, but there are also many innumerable processes of integration where communities are coming together, they're consulting, where there are people who really have the well-being of the world in their hearts and minds and coming up with incredible innovative ideas. And I would wager, I don't gamble, but I would wager that there are far more processes of integration happening. And if we're all to search for them, that we will find them. And that perhaps because of the disintegration that's going on, kind of in the same way that, if you think of, when one is preparing farmland, you have to break up the land. You have to break up the soil and water the ground, and so that when you plant the seed, it grows. I think that process of disintegration is really, it's creating possibility for us to come in and have those much needed conversations. For example, the last 2 weeks, I was traveling a lot for work, and everywhere I turned, people kept asking me about what's happening in this country and, this big election that's coming up. And I found it actually an incredible opportunity to challenge people and ask them, what would it look like to have a process of electing leaders that can be harmonious and that could be unifying? Can we even conceive of where we would choose those who care for the administrative needs of our, whether it be our village, our community, our city block, where we don't have campaigns, where we choose people based on their moral integrity, where we don't attack the character of the people who we're choosing as leaders. Because the situation now is so completely the opposite, it prepares us to be able to have conversations where we can imagine a completely different way of governing ourselves. So I think of course, the situation can cause despair, but I think if we really work on it, it can also create opportunities to have meaningful, transformative conversations, which change our patterns of thought And of course, if we change our patterns of thought, we can conceive of a reality that's completely different from today.
Yeah, I think that's so true, Liliana. I think, one sort of frame for thinking about this is there's so much sense of that the only thing that people understand is force, that you got to be tough. And if you don't force them to do it, they're not going to do it. And if you don't, if somebody, the opposite of the Sermon on the Mount, right? That if somebody strikes you and you don't strike them back, then they're just going to strike you again. And that we have to assume the most cynical aspects of human nature. And there's no doubt that there's a certain reality to that. That is a certain reality in our world, but there's also a kind of Gandhian that if you show people love, you show people compassion, that they'll also respond now. Not every time, but that we can begin creating virtuous cycles instead of vicious cycles. And how can we find in a practical political way the opportunities for doing that and to introduce that into the political discourse? We're really far from that now. So I think it's so important what you're saying about trying to look for these kind of opportunities to do this.
To me, this is like it's more a because if you think, I was just thinking of trying to inject that spirit into, say, national conversations, let alone global conversations. And really, I think it's probably more what you were speaking of, Liliana, in responding to people who come to you, because that's a sort of archetypal question, the state of despair of people of goodwill, the total despair is to just, the responsibility is more to bring this into within our communities, our human relationships, because the problem is that at a national level, language and is amplified through social media. So it's become somehow it needs a transformation language and the way we speak, because if you present something that's good and true, it becomes sloganized and then it loses its life. Because in a way, part of what the veil of sort of seeing the shadow, we see too much shadow, and then everything looks as if it's shadow, so you don't believe anything is good. And so we have to be more humble in a way, but depending what our area of influence is. So like for both of you, your area of influence and relationship is with global conversations. And clearly you've found ways that you can express these things with reality. That's really powerful. In the same way, each little one of us, and whoever we are, we have to find the same degree of will in our relationships with others to find our language. And it might be very few words, or it might be someone like me who just uses more words than ever's needed. But to through our life, to find our own way to give voice to this revelation that's coming into incarnation, and because it's happening in us and through our communities. And
Steve, to that point, one thing I wanted to bring up, which I think actually something Liliana said in her interview with you, and that I think throws a lot of light on this question of moral power, though I'm not sure you guys approached it in that angle, was exactly this issue of the need for optimism. And simply because I think we all would sort of agree, of course, you need a balanced view of reality. We don't need to be overly optimistic or overly pessimistic. But to me, when Liliana described the optimism that was present through that Baha'i initiative, it's actually, to me, you described it as hope, Liliana. And to me, that hope is basically faith in the divinity of the human to triumph over all of its problems and all separation. And this idea that divinity is real, that divinity can act, and it acts through the medium of the human, and that it can act powerfully through the medium of the human, I think is is tremendous light on moral power, and to do so in the context of what is our attitude towards our work. I mean, to me, that just really, I just wanted to highlight that because you said it earlier, but it's just so fundamental to a lot of the questions I see people asking in the chat. What can we do? Well, you know, a lot of it is an action, actually. I mean, that's, of course we need action, but a lot of it is the way we are, the way we inspire others, the way we are in relation to others. And so you see that at the micro, then you feel at the micro and the macro level. We can talk more on this, but I want to, because we're sort of limited on time, I do want to pass it over to the audience participants now, if they do want to chime in and start to ask some questions, that would be happy to integrate those as they come up. You can, the best way to do, there's a lot in the chat. The best way to do it though is for you to raise your hand and ask audibly, and we'll unmute you to do that. One of the other things we wanted to sort of address while waiting on people to organize their questions is I guess it's sort of one of those difficult questions that Liliana mentioned earlier, but it's just, maybe it's not so difficult, but I guess we could ask both of you, what is the, what do you think is, and it doesn't have to be a mundane problem necessarily, like a literal thing, like, you know, the state doing that bad act, whatever. But what do you think is the biggest problem in international relationships today? That if we could really just change one thing, what would it be?
I can follow up, Michael, with really along the lines of of what you were just saying about people changing themselves. And because I think the biggest, if I had to say what's the core of the problem, I think we're having a crisis, an epistemological crisis in the core of how do we know anything today? I mean, if you take a broad view, you know, of history, and you think about, you know, one time before the modern era, people, you know, believed in you know, these mythological approaches to the world, and that came out of the different religious traditions. And then with modernism, you know, all of a sudden, you know, this predominance of rationality sprang forth, and many people really predominated for quite a long time said, no, you know, these are just superstitions. We're going to figure everything out and the world is going to be great. And we'll have science and that'll make the material world great, and philosophy will make the moral world great. And, you know, science, it has done certain things clearly for us, but also it's led to weapons of mass destruction and problems leading to climate change. And moral philosophy, you know, everything can be argued in a million different ways. And I think we're seeing that people don't believe in rationality anymore. They realize that you can't really ultimately figure anything out. And there's a kind of normlessness where people don't know what to believe. And that creates a sense that, you know, maybe anything goes. And then, you know, this Liliana was suggesting the post-truth society, I think, or actually maybe it was Christine earlier, you know, and so, you know, people just will say anything. And we have all these conspiracy theories. And I think, again, with the kind of thing that Steve was just talking about, and I was trying to refer to later, and really you're addressing, Michael, is there a way of grounding reality in some sort of sense of a transcendent, whether we call it God or consciousness or whatever, but that there's a transcendent force that we can actually ascertain, maybe not always perfectly, and we're at different levels of understanding that. But that transcendence is beyond individuals, it's beyond, you know, ethnicities, it's even beyond the earth, you know, that there is something bigger that we can ground reality in. And as that, as Steve keeps saying, starts coming through us more and more, and we can go through that kind of transformation, then that's going to be reflected in our structures. And so I do think, you know, to integrate the political with the spiritual, that if we had to, for purposes of this session that we're all in. We had to identify one thing. I think maybe it's this epistemological crisis, moving away from rationality and away from mythology into a broader sense of the spiritual.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And I was thinking that maybe one of the other fundamental challenges that we're facing today is lack of trust in one another. One of my colleagues was sharing, and I think there was actually somebody who shared this in another meeting that was hosted at our office, about how change happens at the speed of trust. And so if there is no trust among member states, among people, among communities, that it's really going to be hard for us to achieve the level of transformation that's required. And that transformation is multifaceted. It's a transformation in our behavior towards one another, but also perhaps in transforming the way that we perceive one another. And I was actually just looking at one of the questions in the chat about somebody asked, how do you approach the question of knowing what is true and what is good? And I think part of that is looking at the fruits of our actions. You know, if our current behavior is not leading to good results, clearly, and I think truth also has to be based in injustice. And behavior that leads to the well-being of all. So all these things are not separated from one another. But of course, also I think trust and good faith in the way that we behave and the way that we come to just resolutions to the fundamental issues that are plaguing our society. Those things have to be derived from sources of knowledge that are both scientific and religious. And these two branches of knowledge, the branch of knowledge of scientific investigation, and you form a hypothesis and you ask questions and you perform experiments and you try to arrive at the truth, and also divine knowledge that comes from this divine teachers of the world that is mystical, that is divine, that really taps into the nature of who we are two sides of the same coin. And we have to learn how to find inspiration from both of these, because I think that the future of how we're going to be governing our world has to come from these two luminaries of how we understand and conceptualize the world.
Beautiful answers, both of you. I mean, I didn't know what to expect when we prepared that question, but it was exceeded expectations, certainly. Thank you guys both. We do have a hand here from David Trice. David, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Okay. I have a question for Liliana. What do you think about the possibility of someday having punitive action against, for example, Russia and Putin, who invaded Ukraine, getting them off the Security Council by some kind of punitive action, or even Israel at the same time?
Either of you want to take that question?
I think he directed it. I'm happy to, but I think he directed it to Liliana.
Sure, I can attempt it. That is a tough question. I mean, I think, I don't know what the just resolution to these conflicts will be. I think they are, I know just from being around the UN and hearing ongoing conversations that there is, and maybe we don't see it because it's not reported on in the news, but I know that there are incredible efforts that are being made to arrive at diplomatic resolutions to the ongoing conflicts that we see around the world, whether that be the conflicts that you refer to, but also those that perhaps don't receive as much media attention. And I don't know if maybe the people were able to watch the the addresses that were made at the General Assembly, particularly that of Mia Mottley, I think she really provided a strong statement about the amount of oxygen that is being taken up by the contentious conversations that are ongoing today around two conflicts of numerous other conflicts that are ongoing today. I think of Haiti, for example, where this is a country where I grew up. It's where my parents live, where my grandparents live. And every time I go home, my parents have to arrange for armed security to pick me up from the airport because it is not safe to drive in the streets of Haiti because you will get kidnapped. And I had a friend from high school who was kidnapped, and his family had to pay multiple ransoms for him to release. He was held for months on end. And so it really pains me that when we look at the situation of the world today, there is obvious bias towards the conflicts that take up our attention. And there are people in so many countries who are suffering and whose human rights are being violated. And our world's attention is not justly distributed. And so I think and I'm not trying to avoid your question. I'm not an international lawyer, so I cannot say this is the right way to punish world leaders who violate the UN Charter. I think it is going to be the nations of the world through international processes, through the systems that we currently have at our disposal to come up with a solution the solutions to not just these two conflicts, but the ones that are ongoing that they think is just. And it is, but I think for me, it's my reflection on that is that it is unjust that we're not capable of thinking about in equal measures the suffering of all of humanity. And it is unjust that this is reflected in our global governance system. And I'm hoping that through our various individual, collective experiences that we're able to present this injustice to the world's leaders. And through that reflection of that injustice, there will be small steps taken towards better solutions.
I can also take a little bit of a stab at that because I think it operates on multiple levels. I mean, it's a very important, maybe, the crucial question about global governance that governments should not be allowed to blatantly violate international norms and not be held in some way accountable. And I think there's an institutional aspect to it. And, the leadership in, major actors in both the conflicts that were referred to have been referred to the International Court of Justice. There's processes ongoing at any rate there. The International Criminal Court, not the International Court of Justice, but also the International Justice, both. And there are enforcement mechanisms, certainly in the International Criminal Court, and the UN Security Council is able to hold it for decisions of the International Court of Justice. So we're evolving. It's an evolving system, and we're evolving to try and actually institutionalize. And if we could have something like a global parliament, then maybe there could be more, possibility. Also, I think, this part about trust is so important and beginning to really listen to each other. And we all do have these dark sides and this inability, this sort of instinctive ethno-nationalism and this inability to hear other people and to really empathize. And so this sort of spiritual development that we're talking about is so important. And to really be willing to look beyond our own narrow ethnicities and to try and think about things in broader context. And that is not easy, because there's so much fear and there's so much history and everybody has their own narratives. And so I think this part about human development is important. So it's both, I think, the institutional development and the spiritual development that have been our major themes really this afternoon, that are so important. And we're not there yet, clearly, but we are making certain kinds of strides, and we do have certain kinds of institutions. So I think this is a really, really important question, and I think we all, and just finally, the idea of goodwill is really part of this, of people trying to really be honest and look in when it's difficult, when it's difficult to look inside and take the principled position on things and to deal with the fear of that and the humility that takes. These are all really, really important principles, and I think that's a hugely important question.
One thought about that is not to enter into that discussion, because I think you've both handled that. I don't know how else you could handle it, because we're so used to thinking right and wrong. You're wrong, I'm right. And it's not that, but it's so complicated. But what I really like is bringing the story of Haiti into that, because to me, like, this is all about the spirit of relationship. It's all about us gradually beginning to feel related to life and to others. And to a certain extent, through the sort of social media and so on, our heart is softened to these currently two big global crises. They do one thing, they sensitize us to suffering. That's good. They also produce like an answer, some simplistic thing of right and wrong. But at a deeper level, people try to think through themselves. But what's more, at a deeper thing, is this thing of being touched by such difficult lives that so many of our fellows face when it isn't necessary. And there's not a simple answer to any of those things, but to say, okay, I want to be involved in Goodwill. So in working with those people, whoever it is, it's just touching my heart. And in some way, something I do can at least responds to the movement of the heart, because I think that sort of evokes change. Yeah.
This sort of brings us full circle back to our theme, this question of, I guess, what is moral power and how do we wield it?
Yeah.
As a society, as a humanity, as individuals. And we somewhat tritely talk about goodwill at World Goodwill anyway. We define it as love in action, which is very meaningful. But what we could think of what that really means, love in action. It means to wield how does the human being really wield compassion through all of its relationships, at an individual level? What does that really mean to wield the law of compassion, to wield the law of love, at every cost? Because there is a cost to doing so. What does that really look like? So yeah, I mean, obviously there isn't like a final answer for that, but maybe to close, we can give each of you, Liliana and Andrew, because unfortunately we are sort of out of time. We could give each of you, Liliana and Andrew, just a final moment to say something in closing.
Liliana, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I've really enjoyed spending my time with you all today and just being in this conversation. And I'm so grateful to the large of number of people who stuck it out and who stayed with us. And if I may, there was one question in the chat that came up, which somebody asked, what role do women have to play in the evolution of international relations? And there's no straightforward answer to that. And I'm sure much more insightful people who've been thinking about this academically for a long time have a number of expert opinions on it. But maybe as a way of closing, I think part of that answer, a small part of it, has to do with this idea of universal participation. Everybody has a responsibility to add their lot to in their capacity, their energy, their thinking, to really figuring out how we are going to live together harmoniously. And so I'm just so grateful that we have all come together here today to talk, even if our conversation generated more questions than answers, because that's good. That means that we are expanding our energies and our capacity to rethink about the future of humanity. And part of that has to be, how do we ensure that half of the world's population that has been systematically left out of these global conversation, that those voices are making it through from the very, very grassroots level to the international level. And so, of course, the experiences and the wisdom and the intellectual capacity of women has to be part of that solution. And that will look different from different contexts. So it's up to us to figure out what that looks like in our own spheres of influence, whether that sphere is in our home, in our family, or it's in our work environment with our colleagues. Are we making sure that the way that we arrange our work environments reflects that principle? Or when we are organizing international conferences coming together. So I'm just again, very grateful for having been invited to share some of the things that we're learning at the Baha'i International Community. I'm grateful to all of you for listening, and I look forward to continue to engage and to continue this conversation. So thank you so much for today.
So yeah, I want to echo Liliana's thank you. This has been really a very unique experience for me. I do a lot of different kinds of conferences and so forth, and this bringing together of the spiritual and the international law, international relations aspect is something that I just, as you can probably tell from my comments, it's very close to my own heart. I think it's just so important, and really hope that this kind of discussion can really take place more and more in the global system. I think it's just hugely important. Just one comment and one narrow comment, and that is a plug for our second UN charter, is that along the lines that Liliana is talking about, is all through the charter we provide for equitable gender representation, whether it's staff or whether it's members of the parliament or justices on the International Court of Justice. So we really tried to implement that, because no doubt that it's just no way to run a planet is to have way disproportionate numbers of one gender making decisions, and certainly that will lead to, not only is it fair, but to better decision making at the global level. But just to sort of say something finally about this big theme that we're talking about of these differences and all of our confusion and so forth. I think it's really important to not leave on an overly Panglossian note. I mean, it's really easy for all of us to be on our best behavior on a conference like this, and we're all about, wonderful things and lightness. This is hard. It's really hard when we're, out there in the world. We haven't addressed like the nitty gritty of these conflicts that have been sort of lurking in the background. But the feelings are so intense. The interests are so strong. And it's really hard. I'm, just coming out of being a dean in an American law school, which are in many ways universities, as everybody on this call knows, are focal points for these kind of differences. And so it was a big issue. How do you deal with all of this kind of conflict? And how are you in a room with somebody that you think is doing something that's so immoral and so wrong, and still maintain your sense of integrity and not give into it. And this is kind of the situation that we're in. And I think we have to sort of have humility, recognizing that we all have shadows, that we all have dark sides, and an intrinsic respect for ourselves and for other people is just so important, even if they're wrong, even if they're doing, and the implications of what they're doing is absolutely horrible. We still have to respect them as a person and figure out how we're not going to just respond in kind and sort of to try and rise above it. And in the real world, this is much easier to talk about than to do, but I think that's our challenge when we actually go out and try and practice what we're talking about in the streets of life. And it's very difficult, but I think this effort of what you all are doing is absolutely right on and just so, so important. So I've been very, very privileged to be a part of it. Thank you. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you, Liliana. I wish you both the best, and we hope to have you back again sometime soon for perhaps another one of our events. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you, both of you. I think the quality of conversation, one of the ideas we have is we hold certain things in the light. And that's what all of us, how many of us are on 207 right now? So the 207 of us have held these questions deeply in the light that brings together this recognition of the holiness, the sacredness of life, and this unknowingness of our humanity as we struggle to respond to a morality that's appropriate. So thank you both. It's been really wonderful. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, guys. I'm going to take a short break. We're a bit over time, about 10 minutes over, which is fine. So I think we'll cut the break back maybe to about 5 minutes. And then we'll return. Let's round it up. We'll return at 4:20 New York time. So in about 8 minutes. We'll come back for the final section of our conference, which will be a panel on the study of the problems of humanity as a spiritual practice. And so we have some panelists for that. It's going to be a shorter session, about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll have our closing meditation. So thank you all, and we'll be back in about 7 or 8 minutes now. Thank you.
Wait a minute. Yeah. Oh, it's a break. Oh, we're on a break. Oh,
Right. I think we're about ready. I think everybody's back, hopefully, or on their way back. So Chris, if you want to go ahead and get us started.
Okay. Well, Michael, as you mentioned a little bit earlier on, we just going to take 30 minutes or so to talk with two of our Goodwill co-workers who are also students of our online meditation school, to take a look at a study which lies at the heart of World Goodwill's service and which also features strongly in its meditation school. And that is the spiritual practice of the study of what we call the problems of humanity. And this is inspired by a book written by Alice Bailey over the war years. And it was first published in 1947, and it outlines 6 major problems. So, of course, over the years, some material became obsolete and parts were republished, but the overriding principles and problems remained. So these so-called problems have been created by humanity over the centuries and must be dismantled in some way before we can move to a new era of right relations. So just to give you an idea, if you haven't come across this book, of the problems, they are the psychological renewal of the nations, children, youth and education, capital, labor and employment, racial minorities, the churches and organized religion, and the problem of international unity. So Goodwill offers contemporary examples of individuals and groups who work in these particular fields or have written about it in its booklets. So it's not so much a study of the concrete workings of the macro areas, so much as a search for their underlying causes. And this is assisted by creative meditation, thinking about how they impact our lives as well. So the 2 students we've asked are Drs. Thomas Burr and Kim Riley, and they're going to share their experiences of working with these problems over a number of years. And Michael and I will probably ask them a question and they'll respond. Just to give you a little idea of their background, Kim Riley has a PhD in German intellectual and cultural history from Johns Hopkins University, and an MA, a concentration in the philosophy of history from St. John's College in Annapolis, in Maryland. She's also taught history at college level and independent schools for 30 years. So she's currently working with Touchstone's discussion project. And this is an organization dedicated to teaching collaborative thinking skills at the K-12 college and professional development levels. And Michael, I think we're going to put a link to this project in the chat.
Yes.
So it might be worth looking at. And she has a long-term interest in fostering education. She's volunteered in a variety of literacy projects, library expansion, and prison education. In fact, she is currently teaching at the Jessup Women's Prison in Jessup, Maryland. And Thomas Burr is an associate professor of sociology and anthropology at the Illinois State University in Normal, Illinois. He specializes in global historical sociology and cultural sociology. And his first book, Societies Past and Present, A Social Science World History, is scheduled to be published next year. So let's just make a start. And I'll start by asking, why don't each of you tell us a little bit about your experience with studying the problems of humanity and in what ways you have found this study to support your spiritual life?
I'll start.
You-
I have sort of a two-pronged approach. One, as a teacher of history, I think over the years studying the problems of humanity probably pushed my teaching towards thinking about a history class as a way to look at the problems of humanity in the past and how they relate to the present, and how to get students to think about the challenges that human beings face, and also to think about change, because history, I think you can get stuck thinking it's just a bunch of stuff that happened, but actually it really shows you a dynamic of change in human life and human culture and approaches to problems. So for me, there's actually a lot of hope in that. And I think when I think about my own spiritual life privately, and then what I was doing in the classroom, that for me was a way of connecting that sort of spiritual perspective of change and getting people to think about how not just to be upset that humanity has an evil side, but to actually sort of engage with how people have addressed that over time. And then secondly, as my interest in actually taking what I think about meditatively and putting that really in action in the world beyond my professional life, really has led me into many paths of action and thinking about how we can expand people's contacts to the life of the mind, whether it's through libraries or through prison. And then again, particularly this program Touchstones. And when I was listening to the other two speakers, and people are frequently saying today, well, we live in a world where no one can understand each other's point of view. There is this organization, Touchstones, that has been in practice for 40 years, teaching people. It's a method of discussion, teaching of a sequence of discussion skills and practice that really do teach you to listen, to think about how you yourself appear in discussion, what you say. I laughed in the beginning in part because I'm an over talker, and so going first, it was like, ugh, it's not a Touchstone's good thing, but I think that there are methods. There really are people doing more than just saying, oh, we all have to learn to listen to point of view. And think, no, we really have to train people to listen to point of view. And so we'll start by doing that in kindergarten and work all the way through. I've done sessions with adults, and I've done sessions with like 6-year-olds. So I think that for me has really come out of, I think, a passion have come out of my own just many years of meditating and thinking about there really has to be something besides just talking about how we have to talk better to each other. There has to be action on that.
Thank you.
I have a very different, can you hear me?
Yes, go
Okay,
ahead.
I have a very different excuse me, experience. I am not in something nearly so practical as teaching in prisons or in a 40-something-year-old organization that I want to know more about. I didn't know it existed, and I would love to look at it. I have been interested in global issues since being an undergraduate in the 80s, and have been following it since the late 80s in an international relations program and in a history department, and finally sociology, where I finished my education. And writing this book came out of teaching a class on global issues and global history. Um, I guess one of the words that comes to mind when I think, how has it affected my spiritual practice, is responsibility. There are so many major problems, three that don't really come up in the Alice Bailey's book, Problems of Humanity, are environmental problems and gender and economic inequality. But the ones that she listed are still in many ways problematic. And what is my responsibility to, I don't know, study humanity and study how humans live through the centuries and where we are now, and what can we do in the future, and in a period right now which I think is pretty I don't know, for a lot of people, nerve-wracking, not just in the United States for next week, but around the world. um I guess just thinking in global issues, I feel very small. I'm one person, but I can do something. And I just feel that sense of responsibility to do something, to write a world history and to teach it to my students. And also, I guess the one practical thing is to listen to my students, that even though they're in the middle of the United States here in Normal, Illinois, they're North Americans. Americans are notorious for being ahistorical and not paying attention to history, and many other societies are much more historically minded. To teach them that they live in history and they have a future and they can affect, maybe in a disproportionate way as Americans, what happens around the world. In a disproportionate way at the moment. Other countries are developing and maybe more powerful in their future. So I would say my personal responsibility in terms of spiritual practice. Didn't quite know today that I would say that, but that's what I would say.
Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, it's interesting. You both mentioned listening as well,
Yes.
which is interesting. And yeah, and the influence on your students, and no doubt the influence of students on you as well, as you an interactive process.
Just to add, Thomas, I think it's important not to play down that responsibility is actually so fundamental, because in some ways it's that growing sense of responsibility in a global level that actually turns people away from whatever path they may be mindlessly going down or whatever, and actually start to listen. It's just something that has to evoke that beginning of the listening process. And the Tibetan, I think, is quoted, I can't remember the exact quote now, but the responsibility is basically the first sign of the soul, voice of the soul being heard. So it's incredibly consequential. But I just want to say, we have a few more questions to go through, and we'll just kind of make our way through them
Sure.
in the conversation. But Kim and Thomas, if you guys have like a response to the other person, you can just like jump in, as that comes up, and we can go off
Sure.
off the questions we prepared, as we want to. But I thought next we could ask, what do you think it really is that makes the study of the POH spiritual? Like, what is it about studying the problems of humanity that makes it a spiritual practice, or a strong addition to any spiritual practice?
Well, I think in part when I think of meditation, I think partly you're trying to understand your own self, your own inner being, but you're also trying to understand the world around you. And the world around you isn't that obvious. There's all the things we're told, there's all the things we learn. But I think through a meditation, particularly a system of meditation over many years, you learn to think your own thoughts about the problems of the world, and not just to repeat all the things you've heard, and to think about them in a much more multidimensional way. And so for me, I think that the problems of humanity become a kind of content for some meditation or reflection and contemplation. And my experience has been that my sense of understanding, and then also maybe some of the emotional dimension, or comes through meditative reflection. Because your mind's in a different state. Whereas when we're in a conversation like this and you're listening and you're responding, I think it's hard to actually challenge your own ideas, even if you think that's what you're doing. But when you're sitting alone and really letting more come in, I think that's when, for me, you get the bigger vision of what, say a problem in religion or education or anything that we're talking about, what all those multidimensional features are, and maybe even some of the energy that ought to be surrounding them. And that's really clarifying. I think for me, it's become, I think, it's been a fruitful part of my own meditative practice for those reasons.
I would say something different, though I really like that. I live in something that's not very large. There's 130,000 in the two towns we're in, and we're a couple hours from Chicago, and I'm on a college campus, and I live right nearby, and it's kind of very protected. But I walk to campus to my job every day, and I look at my students, and I think that each of them has a bunch of problems. And I find in teaching every semester that students are dealing with far more than I knew just watching them in class. They're dealing with so much. And it's very obvious that many of them are dealing on a super micro level with problems that all humans deal with, or problems that are common in humanity. And I try to focus on developing compassion for them. That's has become increasingly important, especially as I hear of plenty of my colleagues on campus are much more talk to the hand people. If you didn't get it in on time, that's not my problem. And the students are dealing with problems that are far bigger than they are. We are all humans are dealing with these collective problems. We're caught up in them. And so I like what Kim said about, you're just sitting with yourself and you're challenging your own ideas. But I also, sitting with myself helps me think, feel, I don't know. I've faced problems in my life, and they are facing generationally. They're 40 years younger than I am, give or take. Different problems, but still problems. Yeah, I guess I would say compassion.
How do you see, though, Thomas, that a way that maybe your students, say, if they were to take a spiritually minded approach to studying world problems, how do you see a way that could alleviate them or uplift them sort of spiritually, or maybe align them with something that's trying to come through humanity at this time?
I thought about that today. And I'd really like to hear what Kim says about this. I don't know, especially in a sociology classroom, that people would think any sort of mention of spirituality as a real thing rather than something to study is appropriate for a social science. I don't talk about being in a meditation school at all on campus. I don't talk about my spiritual life at all. And maybe I'm not standing up for what I should, or maybe I'm wisely keeping quiet. I don't really know. So to try to bring that into the classroom might also, because of the power of the professor in any classroom, feel like an imposition. They need to listen to what I say. I don't have to listen to them. And they have their own religious points of view or not. There are many agnostic, many are atheist, many are religious, fewer and fewer over the years, regular, Christianity mostly. I don't know that I have a good answer for that question, Michael. I would love to hear what Kim has to say.
I was just going to say, I think I agree with you. I mean, as a teacher, you have to be very careful about espousing your own view, but I always have found that you can ask abstract questions that really do maybe touch on spiritual issues. For example, I've always found teaching history that kids really love the dark stuff. Like almost everyone does. Adults do. As I said, a German cultural historian, believe me, the interest in National Socialism and the Holocaust is always gigantic. It's the best class. People love this. It's unreal. And so I often have asked, why do we respond to this like so intensely, but then let's take another topic that you found maybe less, or a topic that maybe would be inspiring, a positive thing that I could tell you historically. I'll give you some examples. And then what's that response for you? And the kids I've had many great discussions on this one. Is how we have a negativity bias in how we see the world, in how hard it is for us to see good, how fun it is to see evil. I mean, honestly, it is. And I think to challenge that for me is a spiritual practice, because you don't have to use any words or anything. We just get people's mind thinking, well, wow, maybe I should look differently. Or maybe why am I carried away emotionally? Or why do I love feeling so good about myself that I'm not a Nazi, for example, right? It's a low bar. Say this to my kids. This is a low bar, guys. So anyway, like through that way, I think you can bring it into the classroom.
Okay. That actually suggests something. Like I could ask them, what can you do? What can you do beyond yourself? I don't know if you ever asked this, Kim, but what sort of, I don't know, you don't have to call it activism, but higher purpose or greater purpose than yourself. I mean, I could bring it in that way, Michael, rather than explicitly spiritual. I think on college campuses, at least in the United States, maybe in Canada, maybe in other English-speaking countries, I don't know that there's a lot of room for explicit spirituality. I will stick to that. But in other guises, as Kim implies, there might be more room. Higher purpose is something bigger than yourself. That
Yeah, I mean, it really begs
I don't know.
I mean, the question that I posed originally was, how does the study of the POH support a spiritual practice? Begs the question of, well, what really is a spiritual practice at all?
Yeah.
Is it something that's overtly spiritual, or can we extend that definition to include, say, anything that supports the evolution of the human psyche, or anything that has to do with establishing right relationship? Of course, explicit spirituality is something we do with the trust. Like we have a meditation school, so that's another thing. And
I don't know. Can I go to the third question you were going to ask us?
What was that? I mean, that's sort of related, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, so
I was gonna flip it in my answer. So you ask, why not leave problems of humanity to experts?
Yeah.
Well,
what is it that what is, say, like somebody who's spiritually aligned? What can a normal person who's spiritually aligned bring to this question? Because if there's nothing to bring to it, then why bother?
See, I was thinking.
Why not leave it to an expert?
I was thinking that it would be wonderful if we had spiritually minded experts. Why shouldn't the experts be spiritually minded? Maybe what I'm talking about is that there's not enough room in public discourse for greater purposes or anything, either psychological or supernatural or something beyond this world. I don't know that there's much room for that, especially in international fora, because there are so many different beliefs. But I guess your question could assume that experts are not also spiritually minded. And I would like more of them. But your question about normal people, meaning non-experts, people in the street, people attending this, what can they do from a spiritual perspective? I guess cling to their core sensibility, their core beliefs, their core feeling or something, and act from there. That's very vague. Do you have any ideas, Kim?
That's
Can
a
you
great
help me
story,
out?
Kim.
Well, I think, I think that clearly that knowledge and wisdom are really different, and experts have knowledge, but they don't necessarily have wisdom. They don't necessarily have goodwill. They might. There's no reason they wouldn't, but they don't. I do think that to have groups of people like the one we have gathered here today who want to bring the concept of goodwill to the fore, to get people to think about it, to reflect on it themselves, that it works both in terms of information, getting or reminding people that we have to work with goodwill, but also just doing it, I think, or I do believe, increases a certain level of the vibration of that, or the level, the power of that. I mean, certainly we know we can increase ill will by the way we talk, think, and act. So I think obviously we can increase goodwill the same way, so that there's just seems so much room for groups of people to be emphasizing that aspect of every problem, because every human problem has at its core a goodwill issue, I think, or a right human relations issue, where goodwill is not flowing. That's like actually the fundamental problem, or might be at the core of every human problem, is that goodwill is not flowing back and forth. And it's all just then in what venue. And so we really need maybe much more study of what even goodwill is, I think, to really to promote it. I mean, to continue to promote it.
Excuse me. Something stuck in my throat.
The
I
thing
had
is,
go ahead.
I just say also that we don't really just need experts, as I think you were saying, Kim. There are very intense questions and studies within these 6 problems. But what we're really wanting is just ordinary people of goodwill to look at them and to become more informed and to recognize these problems when they come across them in daily life, in their own lives, or just through reading in the newspaper, and start thinking more broadly. It's not for the experts only, it's for all of us, if we have enough interest to engage our minds in creative meditation and creative reflection on these problems. Because they're all of our problems. We've created them, and one day we've got to take them away and dismantle them. And they'll come back in other forms, but there is a progression, I think, through these problems.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we live in a time where to be an expert, it's not required to really have moral conscience isn't a part of that, actually, at all. Unfortunately, I mean, it's often there. A lot of experts do have that, obviously, but it's not required. And expert opinions aren't always written from that perspective. So it's sort of almost like the people of goodwill are sort of in some way the moral conscience, can act as the moral conscience of humanity to a degree. And I think that's a very, very important role. And the more that moral conscience is informed, I think just makes it that much stronger.
Make it stronger, yeah.
Christine, you brought up a good. Oh, Kimberly, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think we were saying the other day when we were talking that I think there's this loss of faith in many ways in experts. And I think some of it is because it's so divorced from a spiritual, and again, it doesn't have to be overtly spiritual, but from a stream of goodwill, we've separated these two things, people with technical knowledge, and then that's it. And so I think there's a natural respect for someone who really does come and speak from a place with goodwill. And when you don't have that, I think, then it's much more difficult. So I just wonder if that's part of the issue that we're having is that we have divorced goodwill and technical expertise so extremely in our current world.
And as we talked yesterday, there is that backlash because of that. There's more and more people being anti-expert, or my attitude is just as good as the experts. And maybe you're touching on why they say that, in terms of the problem, the specific problem. No, your expertise is not as good, but maybe your attitude is better than the expert because the expert is devoid of any moral sense toward other people. Is that what you're saying? And
yeah. Yes.
A lot of technocrats are just technocrats. They don't care, in a sense. And I mean, one of the problems that is identified in Problems of Humanity is capital, labor, and employment. And the last 40 some years, there's been an international system, not just set up, that was right after World War II, but really got going, that has helped corporations, capital, so much. And they are indeed mostly devoid of any morality, any goodwill. It is shareholder value that's what matters. And it's almost surprising to meet people of goodwill in the international system. When you think about international political economy, and yet people like that exist all the time. Here we are. We want better things for humanity. So
I would say, Thomas, though, even though there are so many people working on these problems of goodwill, and that's another thing we could talk about as well, is how much people of goodwill there actually are working on these problems today, and how much of our understanding of that is maybe skewed one way or the other because we don't really have like an actual sociological survey of how many people literally of goodwill are working on certain problems or anything like that.
Yeah.
But like, I question whether it's a matter of like experts not having any moral conscience. Of course, many of them have some, but I think it's a matter of how much of that moral conscience is true. So what does it mean to have a moral conscience that's actually true, or really actually aligned? There are certain moral things we do universally agree on as a society, but what does it mean to sort of lift that up one level above where we are right now? And so that's one of them. I think there's several things that people who are maybe deeply spiritual and have a deep spiritual practice can offer. I think that's one of them, is a deeper alignment of what it means to have a moral conscience. And I think another one is this power of observation. The power to, it was just related to that, to the ability to really see clearly. It's just a pretty touchy subject, actually, because everybody, thinks they see clearly, of course, or many do and they don't, but it's all relative. But yeah.
Do we have time for one more, Michael?
I think so. I know we started late, and then we were supposed to end the whole thing at 5, but we still have to do a meditation. So maybe we could do one more question and then go into the meditation.
One I thought that everyone was wanting to do was the one relating to the fact that a lot of young people today are naturally aligned with the energy of goodwill, and they want to dedicate their lives to helping others and aiding the whole and the good of the whole. And so to ask Kim and Thomas, what advice from their own experience would you offer these young people? And do you offer them?
I will start on that one. I often talk with students about, I offer them, this may be weird, but the underlying attitude is to help them flourish themselves to contribute. And that is, it's the win the lottery question. Suppose you won the lottery. You do not, you can retire. You graduate from college and you're retired. You have a house, you have a car, you have clothes, you have an income every year. What would you do? And it is interesting to see students who will do the exact same thing. They say, yeah, I want to do what I'm doing. And others completely change. And it's almost like they light up inside. They light up internally. And that would be the advice I give. What contribution can you make? Every person has a unique set of talents. Find what you'd really love to do. And if you have to have a 9 to 5 and do it off work, then that's when you do it. And if you can turn it into a career, that's true too. But if doing something that makes you come alive is a contribution. Everybody can make a contribution. I guess that's what I would say. And I agree that Chris, that in contrast to my generation, students do want to contribute to the greater good more. I think they do. And find what you're best at, what makes your heart sing, and try to do that. I don't know if that's very good advice, but it seems to help some of my students. What do you think, Kim?
Yeah, I think I would say for the many students, and I agree that many young people today are quite sincere in their desire to be of some kind of service, but it's to really to think about what you think the good is, and to think very hard about what you think the solutions are, and to really dedicate yourself to keep learning in that topic, or learning in whatever you're interested in, because I think it is easy to fall into just getting received wisdom, particularly for young people who think, well, there's an answer that adults must know. And actually, I would be more inclined to say, just use your own mind, learn as much as you can, learn about opposing points of view, and really then try to form something that is your unique perspective. And so you're not just mouthing the thing that everyone's saying. Most of the problems facing us, I think, are far more complex than the solutions we have offered, or the sort of opposition that gets baked into the kinds of solutions there are, right? So anyway, I would really urge people to just quietly do what the Problems of Humanity is asking you to do, is to take that into your mind and quietly really think about it, and try to find your own unique perspective.
Could I say just one thing?
Yeah,
Just
sure.
I want to apologize to everybody in the chat for not being able to address. We could be here another hour and a half with all the things that people in the chat have addressed, and I've been looking at it occasionally. There are a lot of good comments, and I'd like to take off on them, and no, we're out of time. So I just wanted to acknowledge everybody.
Thomas. One of the questions we didn't get to was the role that meditation plays in all this, which is which is sort of an important one. But so I think maybe we'll have to follow up and have, a follow up to this, maybe one of our monthly webinars or something in the future.
Yeah, maybe we'll start something.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
We did sort of talk about meditation, but yeah, it is, as you say, Michael, crucial, because spirituality in creative meditation is not just about abstract thinking and moving inwards with a mystical perspective, but identifying needs in the world and problems, and turning around and facing those problems, and thinking through and manifesting any ideas and reflections one gets in meditation, and applying them as best one can, thinking through ideas and thoughts. And so it is quite a different approach to spiritual practice in that sense. Well, thank you both. Thank you, and Michael as well, of course.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I guess I'm not as up to all this, up to speed on the timing of this program, Michael. I presume we do have to bring this to a close now and go into our meditation.
Yes, it's time, unfortunately. Yeah.
Okay. So just before we go into our meditation on goodwill, just a heartfelt thanks to all participants and all of our speakers today who've really contributed so much to our attempts to uphold the vision of the will to good in rethinking international relations. Of course, the meeting has been held at such a significant time, both for the US and for international relationships in general. For us, whether we're spiritual meditators or meditators in our vocations and service activities, I'd just like to end with some wise thoughts of a renowned Confucian thinker, Tu Weiming. And here's an extract of his appeal. We're going to put it on the PowerPoint. His appeal to humanity to participate in heaven's great work, as he calls it, and our responsibility as co-creators and thinkers in this process. So we are entrusted to appreciate the wonderful presentation of heaven's resourcefulness and our moral power to actively continue heaven's great work. The ancient Chinese saying, "Heaven engenders, human completes," accurately represents the spirit of this anthropocosmic vision. Heaven so conceived is omnipresent and omniscient, not omnipotent. And to insist on heaven's omnipotence is to accord the cosmic process an all-embracing power of self-adjustment without any reference to the centrality of human participation. An unintended negative consequence of this is an abdication of human responsibility in the maintenance of universal order. Human beings can, through their own personal cultivation, actively take part in heaven's creativity. So now let's go into our meditation on goodwill. We link up in thought with all those people throughout the world who are working with this Goodwill meditation group. Reflect upon the fact of relationship. You are related to your family, your community, your nation, the world of nations, the one humanity made up of all races and nations. Can you move on to meditation, please? We use the mantra of unification. The souls of all are one, and I am one with them. I seek to love, not hate. I seek to serve, and not exact due service. I seek to heal, not hurt. Let pain bring due reward of light and love. Let the soul control the outer form and life and all events, and bring to light the love that underlies the happenings of the time. Let vision come and insight. Let the future stand revealed. Let inner union demonstrate, and outer cleavages be gone. Let love prevail. Let all people love. Reflect upon your own and humanity's relationship with all beings who dwell in the higher realms of mind and heart. The spiritual hierarchy of saints, rishis, bodhisattvas, and masters, honored by all the world's religions and spiritual groups. Imagine that you are standing together within the center of the spiritual hierarchy, immersed in the consciousness of the heart of love. For some, this heart of love is known as the Christ. Other faiths have other names for the one at the center, such as Maitreya, the Imam Mahdi, and the Kalki avatar. Maintaining that high point of contact, let your thoughts reach out to include all members of the human family in whom the energy of goodwill is active. We sound the affirmation of love. In the center of all love I stand. From that center, I, the soul, will outward move. From that center, I, the one who serves, will work. May the love of the divine self be shed abroad in my heart, through my group, and throughout the world. We visualize the energy of love flowing from the spiritual hierarchy through men and women of goodwill into human hearts and minds, infusing them with goodwill and creating loving and harmonious human relationships. Meditate on ways of spreading goodwill, creating right human relationships, and restoring peace on earth. Realize that you are helping to build a channel between the spiritual hierarchy and humanity, through which the energy of goodwill may flow, uniting the human family, solving its problems, and healing differences and cleavages. Linked in thought with men and women of goodwill all over the world, say the great invocation. Say it with deliberation and full commitment to its meaning, knowing that you are radiating its potent energies to humanity. From the point of light within the mind of God, let light stream forth into human minds. Let light descend on earth. From the point of love within the heart of God, Let love stream forth into human hearts. May the coming one return to earth. From the center, where the will of God is known, let purpose guide all little human wills, the purpose which the masters know and serve. From the center, which we call the race of men, let the plan of love and light work out, and may it seal the door where evil dwells. Let light and love and power restore the plan on earth. Thank you, everybody.